Today we're going to take a pause from our characters and learn some shading techniques with Photoshop. So we're going to watch this demo video and I'm going to narrate for you the steps to shade with realistic use of light and shadow as well as texture. Okay, so the first thing you're going to want to do is create a custom 5x7 sheet. You want to make sure you're working in the horizontal mode. Here I have it in the vertical and I'm going to later switch that. But we're going to take our elliptical tool and we're going to create a circle. And that is on its own layer. You're then going to select a color for that circle and fill it in using the paint bucket. Then you deselect by going to select, deselect. And there's our perfect circle. Okay, now I'm going to make a new layer, and on this layer I'm going to create what's called a clipping mask by right-clicking and selecting clipping mask in the drop-down menu. If you can see here, the clipping mask isolates what's below it, so you can only draw on the circle. It won't go outside the circle. Okay, so clipping masks are key to adding shading because they isolate shapes and areas so that you can shade only in those areas and protects other parts of your drawing as you shade. Now, when shading for a realistic kind of smooth quality, you want to select a very soft brush. I selected soft pressure opacity. That means if I press harder, it gets softer. And here you can see I'm adding light and dark just like I would with a pencil, putting my darker tones on the bottom right side, putting a little bit in the back, then coming in and finding where my highlight would be. I'm moving back and forth, creating this sense of dimension by layering on my clipping mask different areas of color. And because my brush is pressure sensitive, more or less paint comes out depending on the size I choose. You can also see I'm working with a fairly large brush so that I can get those areas I'm just grazing them. I'm pressing very lightly, making sure the brush is pretty big. And you can see I'm really focusing on the outside area, building up that dimension, thinking about where my light source is coming and how where it would be lighter would be darker. Here I'm adding more light. But I know I need to add a little bit of dark on the top left because that's where the light starts to move behind. And I'm adjusting my brush as I go. My flow is at 35, so I have good control, but it's not moving too slow. My opacity is at 100%. And then here you can see I just turned down the opacity on the highlight I just added. So you can use the fade tool to fade things. You can also come in with an eraser and turn the opacity way down on the eraser and go over your work to blend it together. Okay, so now I'm creating my background layer. So I've got my sphere. And I'm going to create a shadow with the elliptical tool. I'm just going to pull it out. Following the direction of the sun. And what I'm realizing, and you're going to see in a second, is that I really do need to know what color my table is going to be before I put a shadow down, because my shadow is going to be in the same color family as the table. So I'm going to create another layer. Actually, I'm going to deselect and use this layer. So you can see I'm thinking about my steps. What do I need to do first, second, third? Making mistakes, adjusting them. And now I'm using my marquee tool and the rectangle to create that table color. And then I deselect. And then I create another layer on top of the table, and this is going to be my shadow. And again, I'm pulling that elliptical tool, elongating it, thinking about where does it reach the bottom of the circle. You can see I'm using my arrow keys just to move it up so it's more aligned with the sphere that I've created. And once I have it placed, I'm going to come back to my brush. Again, I'm on soft round pressure opacity. And I need to select my color, making the brush bigger. I've got this darker color. And because it's on pressure opacity, the more I press, the darker it gets, so just like before. But I'm adjusting. I selected a darker shade to go right under. And you can see I'm just lightly brushing over it, getting that shadow. Now I'm going to create another layer, and this will be for the back wall. So I'm moving up, and I'm going to select that space so that I can kind of constrain in there. It is behind my table wall so that I can add shading to it without going onto the table. I filled it in, and I'm creating a clipping mask above it. So adding a new layer and then right-clicking for the clipping mask. And now I've got to decide what kind of shading and texture do I want to put on this back wall. So I'm going to experiment a little bit with a textured brush. And I'm using the charcoal pencil here perhaps, but also looking at other ones, testing the size. And that looks like it's going to give me an interesting texture, but it's too heavy. So I'm going to turn the opacity down and press the little circle thing. That'll make my brush more pressure sensitive, so that I've now got the charcoal brush is now pressure sensitive, so I can get different darks and lights just by pressing, as you see here. And I'm coming through and kind of layering textures, and I'm going to layer different colors together. Where it's lighter, it's going to, on the left side, it'll be lighter, and darker on the right side as we move away from the light, just like on the sphere and the shadow. And I really do want you to experiment with texture here, as you may be using texture in your character designs. Being able to use a variety of brushes to create different effects really is important as an illustrator. You might end up doing a digital painting that looks like watercolor or that looks like graphite or charcoal. So getting to know these brushes and using them regularly to create different effects in your work is really important. So I'm thinking about where would the wall be lighter, where would it be darker, and I'm blending different colors, layering them over each other on this clipping mask layer. And still building it up, thinking about texture. And the texture gives depth to the wall. It really makes us feel like this sphere is in front of a painted surface, maybe like one of those walls that gets sponge painted. Okay, so now I'm creating a clipping mask on my table. My table now, because it has no texture, it looks really fake and flat. So I'm going to come up, I'm going to open a new page in Google, and I'm going to find a tablecloth texture. You can use textures from photographs and lend them to illustrations. So here are images of cloth textures, and I'm going to find one that suits me. I'm looking at grays and beiges now. I need to find one that will work with green, so it's better to stay within the same family. So I'm going to put in green. First, I'm going to put in tablecloth and then select green. And that way I can blend the texture really easily. Problem is I need to find the right green. So I'm scrolling through. You also have to think about angles. Should I find a picture where it is a tablecloth at the same angle, or can I adjust the angle in Photoshop? I'm looking at my work and trying to make that decision. I don't think that's going to work, so I'm going to select a textured swatch of cloth. And I'll angle it in Photoshop. So I'm going to drag and drop this into Photoshop. And there it is. And it's on my clipping mask. And next I'm going to go to Edit, and I'm going to transform skew, and that's going to let me kind of move it at the angle I want it. And I'm going to pull it and push it. And it's okay for it to go off the page. I just need to get that texture at the right angle, so you can see I'm pulling it like it were on a table at that kind of right angle. And because it's a clipping mask, it's not going to go onto the wall, it's going to stay only in the table space. And I'm going to hit enter, and it's going to put it there. Then I can free transform it. Now that I've gotten the right perspective, I'm going to use the free transforms tool to make it bigger and adjust it to fill the space. And again, after you use the free transform tool, to hit enter. And now you can see I have this cloth, and I just turn the opacity down on it to blend it. And so I'm turning the opacity down on the layer to blend it into the color below it. And you want that texture to look really subtle. You don't want it to look super obvious, but it's a nice way of adding more realism into a simple drawing. And there you have it, a shaded sphere on a textured surface against a textured wall. And that is your assignment before we start adding detail and texture to your small animals.